there, Lorcana lovers, my name's Lizard, and today I'm going to talk to you about a highly controversial topic. Which cards, if any, will be the first to be banned in Disney Lorcana? So let's get into it. First and foremost, let's talk about what usually happens when a card is banned from a TCG. Now, having a card banned immediately after it's been released would reflect pretty poorly on the people designing the game. That's not to say this has never happened before, though. For example, look at this card here. Lutri Spell Chaser. This is a Magic the Gathering card, and it was banned before it was even released. If you're curious about this, I'll leave a link in the description and you can read up on it on your own time. But historically, cards that have been banned were not seen as overpowered or needing to be banned until cards from later sets made them so. I like to think of a banned card as a nuclear weapon, where just the fact that it exists in a competitive deck means it effectively must be included in all competitive decks that want to have a chance of success. For example, way back in 2013, there was a Milotic Pokemon card. It allowed you to attach 3 energy cards to another one of your Pokemon during your turn. Now in Pokemon, you can typically only attach 1 energy per turn, just like how in Lorcana, you can typically only add 1 ink to your Inkwell per turn. So when this card was first released, it was definitely strong, but not quite strong enough to be banned. However, later that year, a couple of heavy-hitting Pokemon GX cards were released. Quickly, players realized that being able to accelerate energy onto these Pokemon GX cards meant surefire victory every time. Hence, that Milotic card was banned from competitive play because it made newly released cards way too overpowered. Now, let's go back to Lorcana. I'm convinced that there are 3 cards currently on most players' potential banned list radar. The first one I want to talk about is Be Prepared. This is a 7-cost uninkable card that says, banish all characters. That includes your characters and your opponent's characters. Now, I know this might be a bit of a hot take, but I'll go on record saying, even though this card feels super strong and oppressive when it's played against you, I don't think it's worthy of being banned. Yet. As it stands right now, most seasoned or experienced Lorcana players understand that if they're going up against a deck that has a ruby ink color in it, means there's a high chance that that opponent is going to play Be Prepared at some point in the game, usually promptly on turn 7. Therefore, Be Prepared is a decently telegraphed card, so it's possible to try to play around it. You could maybe try to bait your opponent into playing Be Prepared while you hold on to the cards that you really wanted to play. For example, if I'm playing an aggro Amber deck, I could play a 6-cost Mickey on my turn 6, and there may already be other cards in play, so my opponent may see that as a huge threat. So they play Be Prepared, wipe the board as an answer to that threat. Now, on your turn 7, you play the 2 Lilos that you had in your hand and a bodyguard. So now you're ahead on tempo again, and you'll be questing for a substantial amount during your next turn on turn 8. This is just one example, but there are other ways to outmaneuver a deck playing Be Prepared. And with that in mind, there have been a handful of cards revealed from the next set, and among those cards there is one, an Emerald Ursula card, and this card allows you to look at your opponent's hand and discard a song. It kind of feels like Ravensburger has already recognized the overpowered nature of Be Prepared and are actively trying to remedy it. I personally would much rather this be the answer to overpowered cards, i.e., instead of banning the card, release a card designed to counter it, or at the very least designed to help soften the blow. There's actually another card revealed from set 3 that accomplishes exactly that. Lyle Tiberius Rourke. This card has an amazing ability. It says whenever one of your characters or one of your other characters is banished, each opponent loses a lore. That will give a Ruby player good reason to reconsider playing Be Prepared. So what would it take for Be Prepared to warrant being banned then? Well, as opposed to releasing cards equipped to counter Be Prepared, a few sets from now, a card could be released with an effect that directly enhances the power and utility of Be Prepared. Something along the lines of, say, a location card, and that card says, while your characters are at this location, they can only be banished through challenging. See, a card like that would make Be Prepared a one-sided board wipe, and nobody wants that. Or maybe a card's released that says, gain 1 lore for each banished character this turn. See, basically anything that allows Be Prepared to be more devastating or one-sided would reasonably result in the card being banned. Next up, let's talk about A Whole New World. You and your opponent both discard your hand and then draw 7 cards. This card is in the same exact boat as Be Prepared. In the hands of a skilled player, this card can be devastating. A Whole New World goes really well into a discard deck where it can achieve maximum value, whereas you have a Prince John in play, which allows you to draw a card for every card your opponent discards. Theoretically, Prince John's effect would then allow you to draw way more cards than your opponent and award you a massive advantage. A Whole New World is indeed a powerful card, but even when it's being played alongside Prince John, I still don't think it's oppressive enough to warrant being banned. However, it would only need the addition of 1 card to immediately elevate it to ban status. For instance, imagine a card that says, your opponent must discard cards until the number of cards in their hand is equal to the number of characters in play. Or, how about a card that says, while this character is exerted, your opponent must discard cards until they have only 1 card in their hand. You see what I'm getting at? Playing a card like that alongside A Whole New World would most certainly make A Whole New World completely unfair and overpowered. But you might say, wait, on the flip side, if your opponent plays the very same card against you, then they're effectively stopping you in your tracks from wanting to play A Whole New World. Yeah, this is true, but in my opinion, an interaction like that, this only strengthens the argument for banning A Whole New World. I mean, just think about it. A competitive card game should never be in a state where every deck must include a specific card in order to even have a chance of winning the game. Not only does this make the competitive scene very stale, but it also exemplifies the very nature of a card worthy of being banned. Therefore, if we ever do get a card with an effect similar to the ones I just described, then you better bet that A Whole New World will be the first card on the ban list. Lastly, let's talk about the infamous Goat. Merlin Goat. When this card enters and leaves play, gain 1 lore. I can't tell you how many times I've been beaten by the Goat. And what's more, the defeat always surprises me for some reason. I'm sure a lot of you can relate too. I mean, that's why we're even talking about the Goat to begin with. We should have all learned by now that if you're playing against Amethyst and your opponent is on either 18 or 19 lore, there's a good chance that they're going to play a Goat, bounce a Goat, or both and win the game. And there's nothing you can do to stop them. As infuriating as this is it enough to ban the Goat? I'm inclined to say no, and I'll tell you why. I fully believe that the Goat is a strong card. We should also consider the fact that Ruby Amethyst, which is the deck most frequently playing Goat, is already the strongest deck and probably would still be the strongest even without this Merlin Goat card. So what I mean is Goat isn't necessarily an auto-include when building a Ruby Amethyst deck combination. The Ruby Amethyst deck doesn't have to rely on the Goat to win the game. He is simply a win more card, and when he does win the game, it feels terrible. But to further corroborate my belief, I'll tell you right now that I've lost many times to Ruby Amethyst without my opponent even playing a single Merlin Goat. Ultimately, yes, Goat is very powerful, but he can still be proactively countered or skillfully dealt with. One of the best ways to directly counter the Goat is to overwhelm your opponent with cards that steal lore. Cards like Aladdin, Ursula, or the Ruby Rapunzel, or even Steal from the Rich. So if we're inclined to believe that Ruby Amethyst is still the best deck, one of the best ways to counter it is to also play a Ruby Amethyst deck. With that in mind, instead of playing an Elsa card, which usually was an auto-include when building anything Ruby Amethyst, let's instead just play Ursula, and you'll be better protected from potential late-game Goat shenanigans, being that Ursula's going to subtract a lore away from your opponent and draw you a card. Now another way to beat the GOAT is to simply outpace your opponent in the race for lore. A hyper aggro deck plays very well into most Ruby Amethyst control decks. You just gotta hope you don't come across any steel decks, because if you do, usually a grab your sword is an effective way to wipe your side of the board. But with that being said, I actually rather enjoy a rock, paper, scissors style meta. Whereas control is often weak to aggro, and aggro is weak to steel, and steel is usually weak to the control decks. So I think that's a perfectly acceptable state for the meta to be in. I'd love to know what you guys think though. If you disagree with that, leave a comment down below and explain why. To sum things up, a card should be banned if it's forcing players, or rather restricting players, to only playing decks that include said card, because otherwise you'd have very little chance of winning the game. At this point in time, I'm of the belief that Lorcana currently does not have any cards worthy of being banned. With that being said, both Be Prepared and A Whole New World are absolutely worth keeping our eyes on in the future, because they are most in danger of being accidentally or inadvertently enhanced through the means of future cards being released, which, as I stated earlier, is the most common way for cards to find themselves on a ban list. Discussing a ban list does in fact help all of us as players to understand the immense intricacies of designing a trading card game. I mean, just think about it. One word, think of the word may. Just this one word alone can make or break a card's playability. I mean, look at this Genie card. The inclusion of the word may allows this card to be highly playable. If that word weren't in this card text, you'd be forced in situations to put a card back into your hand or into your opponent's hand that you otherwise would not have wanted to go back into their hand. Imagine they had a card in play that had a really strong on-play ability, like the Ursula we discussed earlier, so if you bounce that back into their hand, you're now going to lose a lore next turn if they decide to play it, and that could lose the game for you. I mean, isn't it crazy how just one word can make such an impact? Keeping all of this in mind, the ability to predict the future of a game and which cards you're going to release later on, that's undoubtedly very challenging. So I'm sure that the game engineers are always carefully calculating just how to word certain card abilities so as to avoid situations where cards need to be banned. Well folks, that's it for this video. Like I said earlier, if you disagree with anything that I've talked about, please let me know in the comments. Or if you agree with it and just have more to add, I'd like to hear your thoughts. So feel free to share that in the comments below. And if you enjoy getting consistent injections of all things Lorcana into your YouTube feed, please consider subscribing to my channel. As always, be kind and have a wonderful day. La, da, da, la, da, da.